Uniforms are constantly being updated around the world, whether it be cut, cloth, color, or camouflage. Elements are always trying to be refined and improved. These steps usually come after a decent period of time trialing and testing different elements. However, on occasion they may be expedited due to external factors. This can end in an overall positive long-term result or a short-term and less than optimal one. One such case that fell into the latter was Turkey's replacement of its first uniquely designed camouflage for one that did not have many fans or last very long. Throughout 2024, a number of camouflage patterns hit the surplus market for enthusiasts, collectors, and just wearers alike to take advantage of. Some were tried and true designs that seemingly never seemed to dry up, with others making large-scale appearances for the first time. However, one that seemed to come out of nowhere was a three-color, brown-dominant one out of Turkey. Printed on a few pieces such as coats, jackets, and trousers, it boasted a color scheme and overall pattern which appeared to be of an older, more analog design method. Looking at it from a certain angle, this didn't seem all that odd, as many nations have been and continue to phase out older, often larger macro-type patterns for newer, sleeker ones that frequently are or incorporate micro-elements. But the thing that made this one different was its introduction in 2018, coming on the heels of one of those newer just-mentioned types, often referred to as M2008 or Turkish Nano, which had been introduced around 2008. So what's the deal? Why did an older, seemingly obsolete form of camouflage replace a newer, more effective one? Up through the late 2000s, Turkey fielded a number of camouflages, with the primary family being various recolorings and copies of US Woodland. Come 2008, a wholly original and native pattern, one that in a way incorporated both older forms of camouflage with newer ones, was introduced, which not only increased the concealment capabilities of wearers, but also gave them a new look which would quickly become tied to Turkey itself. It wouldn't be long until the pattern spread throughout virtually every branch of the country's armed forces, and then even begin to see recolorings, offshoots, and other patterns which took elements of it being developed for use by specific branches and units. As the years progressed, the pattern would begin to find its way to numerous different groups around the world. However, when the 2011 Syrian revolution erupted, which would quickly turn into an insurgency and then a civil war, leading to various newly started or long-running regional conflicts becoming intertwined, Turkey would get involved. With many groups on various sides taking advantage of surplus pieces of Nano, one would think this would cause security problems, as often when a pattern becomes so deregulated, dangers may rise for official wearers. And that very well may have been the case. However, it wasn't factors from outside the country that would sow the seeds for the end of the camouflage, but ones from within. During the evening of July 15, 2016, Turkey saw an attempted coup to overthrow its government. Led by elements of the armed forces and seeing various levels of support from almost every branch and agency, this group called themselves the Peace at Home Council, named after an old Mustafa Kemal Ataturk slogan, "Peace at home, peace in the world," launched a coup to overthrow President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and his government. Seeing primary events unfold in the capital of Istanbul as well as cities of Ankara and Marmaris, mutinying troops flooded the streets while jets and helicopters flew through the air. Reasons for the coup vary, with some still being contested and analyzed, but the most significant, and also debated, came in the form of clashing political ideologies and movements, specifically that of Gulanism, which is usually referred to as the Gulen movement, as well as Erdoganism and Kemalism. Keeping it short, the Gulen movement is named after cleric Fethullah Gulen, who once was a political ally of Erdogan. Since the 1970s, he and his movement have claimed to not be a political one, but rather more of a social one, trying to essentially work with secular states to promote moderate Islam and interfaith dialogue, along with a blending of traditional and progressive policies and ideals. As far as Turkey goes, however, having a number of followers both in and outside of Turkish society, it for a while influenced a number of elements such as news agencies, educational and lobby institutions and organizations, government and military positions, and television stations, among others. This for a while, along with other elements aligned with Erdogan. However, as his influence grew in the country, the two began to butt heads. Moving now to Kemalism, it comes from the founder of present-day Turkey, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who essentially brought the nation out of the ruins of the Ottoman Empire and led it from its founding in 1923 until his death in 1938. During that time, he implemented policies which took elements from Western ones while also promoting nationalism, pan-Turkism, secularism, and the pursuit and support of statism, sciences, as well as more progressive social topics. As a part of this, the Turkish armed forces took to seeing themselves as not only protectors of the people and the nation, but also this belief, and since his death has seen elements of its staged governmental interventions, all of which can be said to have initiated due to political discord that could be considered a threat to those principles or the order of the nation. These often came in the form of coups of varying sizes, with the 2016 essentially being a continuation of this chain. However, unlike the others, there were two main differences: the absence of many high-ranking officers, and more significantly, overwhelming opposition from the populace. That brings us to Erdoganism, which began to take shape around 2011 and since then has been growing as the more dominant entity in the political realm. Interpreted in a few different ways, it generally boils down to a sort of zealous admiration around Erdogan, more conservative approaches to things, promotion of populism and traditionalism, which frequently comes in the form of venerating the Ottoman Empire and boosting nationalistic sentiment, and downplaying or removing components of secularism and certain elements of Westernism. So you can see these movements and political ideologies, though sharing some overlap, in a way clash, and as such it seemed that elements of the armed forces took it upon themselves to act against what they felt was a growing problem within the country. And so on the night of the 15th, they activated, taking advantage of Erdogan's absence as he was outside the capital on vacation. As mentioned earlier, throughout the night, soldiers, primarily dressed in uniforms bearing the Nano camouflage, tried to secure sections of various cities and the people within them. However, for the most part, they did not have the support of the populace, who took to the streets in protest while also facing off against groups of mutinying troops. By 4 a.m. on the 16th, Erdogan was back in Istanbul addressing crowds at the airport, with many participating in the coup ceasing hostilities and surrendering throughout the morning. In the pursuing weeks and months, the government launched a series of actions which saw numerous suspensions, removals, and arrests of people and officials from various civil, military, and political positions, while also shutting down numerous media outlets and educational institutions which were said to have connections to Gulen. In addition, the entire movement was called a parallel state and even labeled a terrorist organization in May, being designated FETO, standing for Fethullahçı Terör Örgütü, or in English, the Fethullahist Terrorist Organization. Now, there was quite a bit more going on, and the fallout from it was wide-reaching, with many pointing fingers while also speculating, but for our story it essentially stirred up the government and military. Though a vast majority of the armed forces remained loyal during the coup, the association the Nano camouflage now had with those attempting to take control was evident, and, coupled with research into improving uniforms themselves already in progress, a new camouflage was bound to happen. And not long after those events, the chief of Turkish General Staff, General Hulusi Akar, ordered the process be expedited. Fast forward to January of 2018, and Turkey, which had been involved in the ongoing Syrian civil war since December of 2011, found itself initiating a cross-border operation into the country, specifically the Kurdish-dominant district of Afrin in the northwest. With the assistance of the Syrian National Army, the Turkish armed forces took on the People's Protection Units, also known as the YPG, which itself was a part of the greater SDF, or Syrian Democratic Forces. Technically a part of the Syrian civil war, this engagement was also referred to as the Rojava conflict, which saw a majority Kurdish coalition attempt to not only retain control of the region but also establish a new constitution and stronger independent governance, which was also considered an entry in the greater series of Kurdish uprisings and insurgencies around the region, which has been ongoing, granted not continuously with Turkey since 1921, but really stretches back hundreds of years, involving many others. This cross-border operation gained the official name of Operation Olive Branch, which saw conventional military fighting go until the end of March, where the city of Afrin would be captured, resulting in a protracted insurgency. As this fighting was going on, though, a majority of Turkish troops located within the region were still wearing the Nano, but on the command level, a new one was introduced. In the initial days, certain generals and officers in charge of it were photographed wearing a few different uniforms, two of which bore camouflage. The first was the Air Force's Nano, and the other a brand new one featured on an equally new uniform. Going forward, we will refer to this brown dominant pattern as M2018 due to it not seeming to have any official designation or common name, as it would only later on gain the informal name of Bedali Uniforması, or paid uniform, referring to a specific type of paid military service, which we'll get to in a little bit. From there, it seems the camouflage would slowly spread throughout command levels with some coverage, but it wouldn't really be seen or talked about in any big way until President Erdogan was observed wearing it to events shortly after. On April 1st, he visited Antakya, a city located in the southernmost province of Hatay, which is wedged between the Mediterranean Sea and Syria. Accompanying him were a number of military officers, politicians, journalists, artists, musicians, and athletes, all of whom were there as a way to both acknowledge and help bolster morale of border troops and those taking part in Operation Olive Branch. Seen throughout the events, his choice of outfit, being the new camouflage uniform, left many discussing it for days, both throughout the country and online. Later in the month, a number of articles were published stating how this new uniform would become the main one for a majority of service members starting on July 15th, while also touting a series of new improvements and updates, many of which were visible, and to best showcase that, let's quickly compare a standard Nano Field uniform's jacket and trousers with its M2018 counterpart. Though some Turkish uniforms saw their tops vary in overall length, as you can see here between the one on the left and the right, which is often dependent on uniform orders as well as regions, mainly the older Nano's top had a basic button front closure with a more closed-off collar, squared-off expandable chest pockets, a small open shoulder pocket, and adjustable button cuffs, while the trousers featured a simple button fly, 2 inset waist pockets, 2 button rear, and 2 cargo with adjustable elastic bottoms. Now, before diving into the M2018, it is worth noting that between the original Nano as just seen and the M2018, there were a few uniform updates, though they never quite got to the full level of issuance as they were frequently given to specialty or smaller units such as Navy divers and so on. But looking at the M2018 though, you can immediately see it was completely overhauled as the top featured a more open collar, zippered angled inset chest pockets, which followed a trend of many uniforms adding them to be less intrusive and easier to access when wearing vests and other gear, the shoulder pocket now being zippered, and a modified design for the adjustable cuffs. Meanwhile, the trousers remained similar, seeing only the removal of both waist adjuster methods, those being the internal drawstring and external tabs, removal of the rear button belt loop, and smaller things such as changes to pocket flap button orientations, as well as belt loop dimensions. It is important to say though that some of these features were not initially introduced when these new uniforms came out, but rather incorporated into a few as early as 2016. But like the aforementioned updated Nano uniforms, they never quite caught on, only being seen sometimes worn by high-ranking officers, and more notably with troops sent to Qatar, where it also saw the inclusion of a lighter, more arid version of Nano. But you get the idea. The uniform refined some features while eliminating ones that could be seen as outdated and or a hindrance. In addition to that, there were developments which stated the fabric would dry 8 times faster while being more breathable and conceal wearers from satellite imagery, while also protecting them from ultraviolet rays. However, specifics behind the camouflage pattern it bore was a bit more vague, with claims that it was designed using nanotechnology, which would prevent visuals from medium to long distances, as well as more obvious things like it being much larger and darker when compared to the older Nano. The most interesting element, however, was some articles stating how its introduction in a way was one of the final steps the government took in response to the 2016 coup attempt, as the issuance start date marked the 2-year anniversary of it, with a translated portion of an article published by TRT Haber stating the following. It is considered that with the change in uniforms, the bad impression created by the members of the Fethullah terrorist organization, FETO, who infiltrated the Turkish armed forces on July 15, 2016, will be eliminated. From July of 2018 onward, though, the pattern would begin to replace the standard Nano design, with early sightings of it in use coming in January of 2019 during training and exercises along the border with Syria. But let's now shift gears here a bit and talk about the actual design. Though not a whole lot was released or discussed officially, there is still quite a bit to go over, most of which sort of helps paint a picture as to why it was so short-lived. To start, let's look at the pattern close up. As you can see, it includes only 3 colors: a tan, a dark green, and a dark brown. If you know camouflage, or at least saw many newer designs from that time, it seems like a strange choice to go from what could be seen as a newer, more advanced pattern to something that could be interpreted as antiquated and falling in the older analog style of camouflage, that being larger shapes with a more basic design. Though a bit less nuanced when stacked up against newer ones, the pattern did slightly fit many regions and terrains found throughout the nation, at least from a color standpoint, as Turkey is largely composed of rocky, mountainous, and semi-arid regions that also sees a variety of forested areas. As you move further east, this becomes more prevalent, and being that the ongoing Syrian war was right next door, many troops would be operating in and around these areas. Sounds good, right? Well, maybe, but often things like public perception and feedback frequently play a part, and in this case, they were not very positive. Almost immediately, people began to criticize, poke fun at, and generally disparage the pattern and choice to replace the older one. Online reactions ranged, but generally found it less than favorable, calling it ugly, less prestigious, something you'd see 30 years ago or worn by a duck hunter, degrading, and even joked about its quasi-public reveal coming on April 1st, April Fool's Day. On top of this, others compared it to patterns you may see in Africa or France, which actually brings up an interesting connection. If you take the pattern and place it next to France's Central Europe, or CE pattern, which was first introduced in the 1990s, you'll see that they seem a bit similar. In fact, the 2 patterns are almost identical, with only 3 differences between them. The first is the most obvious, in that the French pattern is a more temperate woodland scheme, while the Turkish is a bit more arid. The second can be noted if you put the 2 designs right next to one another, as they share many of the same shapes, granted with some minor edge and thickness differences. And the third kind of relates to the previous two, in that the only reason some of the Turkish pattern shapes and color count are altered is because the black shapes from the French were recolored and incorporated into the browns. Now, other nations borrowing, copying, or basing their designs off of others isn't something new and has been seen all across the world, but as stated in this instance, it came off as odd to many, and with the lack of specifics behind the design process led to a bit of head scratching. Some also pointed out how in photos of it being used, specifically during the January 2019 training exercises, certain forces wore the pattern but had supplementary components such as pack covers in the Nano, which appeared to blend in better with the terrain. So essentially, you had a uniform cut that was more or less received well, but bearing a confusing camouflage that was pretty much panned by most. Though it's hard to gauge exactly how extensively the pattern was issued and used, it did make its rounds, and not only among Turkish armed forces. Originally issued to soldiers throughout the country, the pattern never quite got to the full level in the sense of it being a fully implemented pattern, as in 2020 yet another camouflage was announced which would take its place. This pattern, first being seen worn by higher-ups, began to trickle down in 2021, and though a bit different, was more of a proper successor to Nano in both color and design, so much so that it would gain an unofficial name of New Nano. This is where the M2018's unofficial name would come into play, as remaining stocks would be issued to those who would pay to shorten their required military service. Since June of 2019, required service was shortened from 1 year to just 6 months. All conscripts have to go through a period of training after which they can pay to shorten their required 6 months to just 1. Those that did were given these uniforms, while ones remaining in service for the other 5 continued on for an additional period, or when professional, would be issued with new Nano ones. It wouldn't be until 2024 did the M2018 finally become fully replaced, as stocks of it were made in such large quantities. Now, the fate of many of these uniforms fell into one of 3 categories: surplus to the public, shredded and recycled as a part of a zero-waste project where the fabric from them were mixed with other recyclable materials such as plastic bottles and actually turned into material to produce new uniforms, and finally into the hands of various other armed forces, which more often than not was done so at the behest of the Turkish government. Whereas Nano had a knack of getting into the hands of various forces, some of which were actually fighting on opposite sides of the same conflict, the M2018 found its way to a few different groups, with 2 actually through official channels. The earliest and closest came in 2019 when Turkey began providing uniforms bearing the pattern to a variety of militias, units, and rebel groups that aligned with the country fighting within Syria, most notably elements of the Syrian National Army such as the Sultan Murad and Hamza divisions. Additionally, some portions of these Turkish-backed groups have been hired to operate within Libya, meaning the pattern may too have appeared there. But on the topic of Africa, the second official use actually comes from there, specifically Somalia, where in 2022, troops trained by Turkish forces were equipped with the pattern. Since 1969, Turkey has had a level of relations with Somalia, and though the nation has seen various transitional governments since the Somali Civil War in the mid-90s, Turkey has continued to engage diplomatically. In 2017, Camp Turksum was opened, which not only housed members of the Turkish armed forces, but also served as a sort of university where Somali units could be trained. As a part of this ongoing relationship, certain units were equipped with uniforms, which isn't a new thing, as early as 2014, Turkey had been sending material support, with one of the largest coming in 2019, consisting of uniforms to equip some 60,000 troops. The third major, though granted unofficial one, comes out of Ukraine. As seen over the years with the prolonged Russo-Ukrainian War, many elements of Ukraine's armed forces were early on supplemented with a variety of surplus garments. Over the last few years, though, Ukraine has done a better job producing and providing uniforms. Various international ones continue to be seen among their ranks, often provided by private purchases or donations, and this pattern seems to be one of the newer examples of this. Additionally, when Russia officially invaded in 2022, a number of international fighters came in on both sides, sometimes used to supplement existing units, other times they would form dedicated ones, and as such the pattern has actually been seen in both small and moderate scales. A good example of this was the Tehran Battalion, created in 2022, which released a video showing a handful of fighters, all of whom were wearing the pattern. This, however, coupled with a few other factors, has led some to believe they, in part, are receiving support from Turkey directly. Now, these are just 3 examples, and since the pattern appeared in mass on surplus markets in 2024, chances are good they'll show up in other conflict zones over the coming years. Now, this pattern, which we've unofficially dubbed M2018, still has a bit of strangeness and mystery to it due to its somewhat vague origins and short-term use. Though seen and officially used by Turkey only for a few years, it found itself wedged right in between 2 periods of discord: the 2016 coup attempt and the increased military interventions in Syria. Because of this and other factors, it is possible it was seen so briefly for a few reasons. The first is that it was a sort of stopgap design between a pattern that gained a level of negative connotation and a more proper replacement. Between the events of the coup and the accelerated design process as ordered by General Ankara, a uniform that may have been in the works had to be rushed without a proper camouflage design to accompany it. Looking at one more uniform, which is the new Nano design, you can see that it is nearly identical to the one bearing the M2018, seeing only minor tweaks along with the largest changes being the addition of a second shoulder pocket on the top and a small lower leg one on the trousers, meaning that the new features and cut appeared to have been pretty close to completion, but the camouflage wasn't. The second is that it was actually a misstep due to the accelerated process, which ultimately saw the creation of a design that wasn't fully fleshed or thought out. This can be argued due to the sheer number of uniforms produced, the staggering amount of almost instant negative feedback, and the quick announcement of a new camouflage made to replace it. Finally, perhaps it was a little bit of column A and a little of column B. Whatever the case though, it has since left its mark on Turkey, some of its allies, and other forces who now take advantage of the excessive amounts of surplus pieces. But on that note though, we've more or less reached the end of this video. Hopefully it shed a bit of light on this pattern that seemingly came out of nowhere for many who collect or just keep up on things related to uniforms and camouflage. In this video, other Turkish camouflage patterns were mentioned and talked a bit about as far as introductions, usage, and retirement, but fret not, dedicated videos for them will be done in the future, as they too have extensive stories to tell. If you enjoyed this video, perhaps leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet done so. If the mood doesn't strike you, that's all well and good. Just be sure to head on back soon for more of the history of, right here on Uniform History.